North Star metric is really the focal point of how you want to tell your story.
Can we say that North Star metrics ties back to like vision, mission of an organization?
Most really great North Star metrics don't talk about averages or percentages. And I'll tell you why. So in the context here, I'm calling them vanity metrics. Typical ones that I would consider vanity metrics are, in order to achieve big results, you need focus. So I think that, a North Star can help and provide that kind of focus.
Common mistakes that you know about that people may make while figuring out their North Star metric.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest mistake that people make is not having one. And I'd say the second biggest mistake that people make is having two.
Welcome. This is an Hour of Innovation podcast. I'm your host, Lyoshin. Nolan Myers joins me today to break down the power of North Star metrics, what they are, why they matter, and how to define one that drives real growth. Welcome, Nolan. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Vit. So good to be here.
Yeah, great. So before we jump into the topic, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, the work that you do, and things like that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm an executive coach and product management consultant. So my day-to-day is I help founders and product executives lead with more confidence and authenticity. I have a background of 20 years of operations as an operator, working as a CEO, as a product manager, as a customer success leader. So I've held executive positions in a variety of different functions, and really enjoy the practice of working with leaders who are innovating. I love innovation. I love sort of where great ideas come from and how you actually bring them to fruition. So it's a joy to work in that space, and it's good to be on your podcast as well. I know that's your focus.
Yeah, that's great. All right, thanks for sharing this. So let's start conversation with defining what North Star metrics are.
Yeah, so a North Star metric, I think of them primarily in the context of a startup, though I think they can apply in a variety of contexts as well. So I'll use mostly startups talking about it, but they can also be, for one team in a larger company. But a North Star metric is really the focal point of how you want to tell your story, right? What is the main thing that you want to tell that you've achieved? And I think it's also a great way of aligning your team around achieving that thing, so you actually have a great story to tell.
Okay, I see. And then, so how is it different from other metrics, if I may ask?
Yeah, so there are many metrics that we all track. Everybody has KPIs of a lot of different things, and KPIs are very important. What I think distinguishes a North Star from other KPIs is that your North Star provides direction. It should provide pull. It should actually say, hey, we are moving in this direction. We're going this way. Your other KPIs can provide guardrails or information or sort of helping you see, are you doing okay in a variety of different ways as you're going along that path, right? So think of it as the thing that pulls you in the right direction versus the thing that helps you calibrate sort of are your axles turning on the right speed.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, can we say that North Star metrics ties back to like vision, mission of an organization?
Yeah, that's great. You really want it to be, it is the single focal point, your most important metric. YC sometimes calls it the metric above all other metrics. So you can, there could be multiple names for it, but the idea is to provide a singular point of focus that gives you and your team direction on where you're going and a way to tell the story of what you've achieved when you get there.
Okay. And then so to differentiate it from all other metrics, it has to be central navigation point for organization. Are there any other qualities of a good North Star metric?
Well, yeah. So now we're going into sort of like what actually is a good thing to be shooting for. Like, why would you choose this one metric over other metrics that you might look at? And I think there are three characteristics that go along with making a good North Star metric. The first is that, so they're valuable actionable, and investable. And so what I mean by each of those, by valuable, I mean that it represents your customer or your user having achieved something that they were trying to do through your product or through your company, right? So it valuable means that your customer has actually gotten something of value from it. Actionable means that you can actually take action, that your whole team can do something to affect the metric. It's not something about the broader world. It's not a byproduct of the work that you're doing, but that there are multiple paths to influencing it and saying, hey, we can actually drive this number and improve it. And investable just means that it's something that, let's say you do get that growth with it, that it actually attracts the right kind of investors, and people are going to come in and say, hey, I think you're onto something here. I like what you're achieving. I want to help bring this to the next level.
I see. Okay. Can you give a couple of examples of North Star metrics?
Yeah, of course. There are canonical ones, so Uber and Airbnb are sort of the poster children of this. And I should say that Y Combinator uses, they in their accelerator, they ask every company to have a North Star or a metric above all metrics for the 3 months that you're working at Y Combinator. Both Uber and Airbnb, coming from that mindset, also had North Star metrics. And it'll give you an example of just sort of how clearly they convey and how obvious it is when you have a good North Star metric. But Uber is the number of rides completed, and Airbnb is the number of nights booked, right? So I think of it almost like McDonald's, right? McDonald's is famous for saying, hey, it's millions and millions served. Right? There's a good, or now billions and billions served. There's a good North Star metric, and how growing it actually tells a compelling story just by itself.
Okay, so this type North Star metric in Uber's case, let's say completed rides, it touches, and because it's like multiple users, I guess they serve in drivers as well as riders, or people like you and I who ride cars, right?
Yeah,
that metric is actually touches both sides, so it's really
great. Yeah, and that's a great insight there, Vit. Thank you, because it shows that, so Uber is about creating a marketplace. Actually, so is Airbnb. You need both. In Uber, you need a rider to want a ride, and you need a driver to actually complete it. So this number of rides completed shows that the whole chain has come together and created something of value.
Yeah, so it's value for both participants, basically, right? Riders have rides completed, and drivers who actually do that service. So yeah, that's
and
great.
Imagine if you did it a different way, right? You could think about it as, you could think about it as the amount of money that drivers are doing, or the number of minutes, right? The number of minutes in a ride. Now, one of the things that's great about it is that when you see a good North Star metric, it feels inevitable. It's like, John Baptiste said something when he was talking about great music, and I have a music background. I'm an artist at heart, but a great piece of music feels inevitable. It just flows. And I think the same is true of a great North Star metric. When you see it, it's like, yeah, duh, that's the right thing. That's brain dead simple. Of course, that's the right one. But a lot of people struggle to actually sort of have that clarity and say that's what it is. And imagine if you had number of minutes booked, then you're going to have, then you have an incentive for the drivers to take longer to get where they're going. You want the completed ride, right? And that's a much more valuable metric to have.
Yeah. Are there any cases when so this is like a whole number, right? Number of rides, it's a number. Are there sometimes they use like averages or percentages or any other, like those are used in many other metrics, like what's your average per month, what's your percentage of X? How about North Star metric in this case?
Yeah, I think most really great North Star metrics don't talk about averages or percentages, and I'll tell you why. A percentage caps out at 100. It's like when 100%, you're done. There's nothing to achieve from there, and especially in a startup environment. Startups are about growth, right? You don't have a healthy startup that just stays as it is. It has to keep growing. And so to have a metric that just caps out and can't get any better, well, there's nothing to go. There's nowhere to go from there. You want something that's just going to grow. I don't like averages for the same kind of reason, in that they're a little bit more calibrated. So I'll give you an example. In an article I wrote about North Star metrics, I did a little research and found that Salesforce used the average number of records per account. And I get that works, and you want to have a lot of records, on each account. But it also, if you think about it, disincentivizes you to bring on a new account, because when you first bring on a new account, now your average is going to drop a little bit. And so even though your company is growing and you're improving, you've now taken a hit to your metrics. So you see it sort of going up and down as you go. So I'm not crazy about that. I think a much better metric, even for Salesforce, would be total number of records, right? There's something, it's like you get a new customer, you add one, you grow an existing customer, you also add one. And so in that case, both of those show that growth. You're not having to sort of worry about whether it's staying calibrated within a particular range.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, an average is always kind of weird because you will have to deal with those outliers and how to deal with it. It could be tricky, especially if it's your like one single most important thing you marching towards. You have to explain. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's also another good distinction. You asked about sort of the difference between a North Star versus other KPIs. I think averages work great for other KPIs. There's many other ways in a business that you might want to calibrate things, right? But a North Star should be a guidelight, not a calibration.
Mm-hmm. And then I also read from your work that the default should be revenue for the North Star metric. Can you explain this idea? Why revenue rather than like what Uber did, for example?
Yeah, so I should say I think revenue is a good default and not always the best one, but it's always going to be valuable and investable. You know that if your revenue number is going to go up, if somebody has chosen to pay for it, it's a proxy for value. And if your revenue is going up, people are going to be interested in investing. Right. So I think revenue has a lot going for it. And if you don't have anything else, if you don't want to spend any time, I'd say start with revenue, and then maybe over time you come up with a better North Star. Some reasons why you might want to consider other things than revenue. One, I think the biggest one is that revenue, it might cause an incentive to focus on the amount of money that your company takes versus the amount of value created. Right. So if you're creating a certain amount of value, then only some amount of that you're actually going to be able to capture. And with revenue is talking about the amount of value that you've captured, not the amount of value that you've created. Ideally, a North Star would be a little bit more aligned with the value that you want to create in the world rather than the amount of value that you want to capture for your company. Okay, so that's another good sort of sign of a directional thing. The other thing is that in many enterprise contexts, revenue might not be as actionable as you want it to be. So revenue works pretty well when you have a fast selling product, when it's like something that somebody can consider for a few minutes and make a purchase. That's great because then you have a lot of at-bats and you have a lot of tries to actually get that revenue, and revenue would be a pretty good proxy there. But in a more complex sale, revenue is not something that is going to be influenceable on a bi-weekly basis. And that's the other thing about actionable. I'm realizing I forgot to mention sort of early on, when I talk about actionable, it's, it means that your team can do it, but it also means that on a short iterative cycle, you can influence it. It's not something you're thinking 6 months down the road. It's something that, hey, there are actions I can take today. They're going to have an influence on this number, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks from now, but not 6 months down the line.
Okay. So while you're talking, I'm thinking about like a stock market and all these public companies, how they've been judged many times by their financial performance rather than, it's of course being measured by that value creation metrics as well. It's kind of behind the scenes. You have to listen to calls, you have to read their more detailed reports to figure out like how many things they produce, how many customers they acquired or whatever. But primarily it's all finance data, and it's like a maybe default natural thing to say, well, the value of the company is this much and attach dollar number there. So I think it's important to understand that it's maybe your default in the beginning, but it's better to define something else which is really going to measure your potential and things like that.
Yeah. And of course, as a public company, you have so many different factors that you have to weigh in. You're actually a lot talking about what is the performance relative to expectation. So a lot of work goes into setting the right expectation and then calibrating. And so all of those things, at a company, at a public side, they may have other things in addition to a North Star. A North Star might be a better concept there for a team that's operating within it. That's focused more on growth, or some important transition. A friend of mine told me that, he thought a great example of a North Star is, let's say you're leading a transition of a data center. Your North Star, let's say that you want to move out of a legacy data center, right? You have a number of servers running in some legacy, you want to get rid of it. There, you might want a North Star of just how many servers are still up and running in my legacy data center. And it starts at 30,000 and you're bringing it down to 0. And so your North Star in that case is 0, right? Now there is a good place where you might, you say, hey, I have a North Star that drives me towards the growth, but you also want some other KPIs that you're going to be using to calibrate along the way. Like you want to do it without just shutting the power off on everything and taking them out. You need to migrate the services that are running on those servers first. So, at larger and larger of scale, you might want other KPIs that you're using to calibrate, but you still have that guiding light that's pulling you in the direction that you want to go and that aligns the team around it.
Yeah. So that was my kind of next question. Can you set up North Star metrics, or does it make sense to set up North Star metrics for each department within an organization, for example, and they all have their own kind of guiding number?
Yeah. I think it does. I think most projects will benefit from having a one metric that is more important than your other metrics. Because if you think about it, even within a large company, storytelling is super important. And we are all inundated with so many stories these days. Your North Star is I think of it as almost the centerpiece of your story, right? If you are tasked with migrating out of a data center, you want to be able to show progress, and you want to say, hey, I started with this many, and my goal is to get to 0 by this date. And here's a progress line that's showing how I'm tracking toward that. And now all the other things, it's like, there's many other things that you need to balance as you're doing that. But that's the centerpiece of your story that shows that it allows you to tout your success to others. And that's one of the biggest values of a North Star metric, is that it's the centerpiece of a compelling story.
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. So let's talk about how organizations can figure out what their North Star metric is, where to start, what the steps are to get into that point.
Yeah, there's so many. This depends so much. I think the first step with any of these things, I mean, with so many creative endeavors, is just visualize it. Just start with what is the most important thing that you're trying to achieve? What is the most important story that you want to tell 6 months or a year from now? And what is going to be the centerpiece of that story? What's going to show the growth that you want to be able to tout? Because right there is, in that question, is going to be a core insight that's going to help you see what your North Star should be. And I also think, pick one, try it on. So try one, imagine what it's like. Imagine all the different ways that you could achieve that and the ways that it'll incentivize people on your team to actually start taking action.
So people should be picking something that is like the whole organization wide, or be a little bit more narrow. How that visualization should basically work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, it's almost sort of like, how scalable is it? I think it depends a little bit on how much the organization has a singular focus. So for instance, McDonald's, I think they even at their scale, a North Star metric going from billions and billions served, I think that's a really great, compelling North Star metric that the entire organization could use.
Mm-hmm.
I think with a company like Alphabet, it's much more complicated to have a singular North Star, right? Like there's just so many different divisions doing different things that it would be hard for me to imagine a North Star. But now I could imagine Google search having a singular North Star, satisfied queries. I could imagine Google Docs or, Docs or spreadsheets or whatever workplace. I think each of them could have a North Star. So I think it depends on sort of how it's more of a logical grouping around how unified is the department or team that or product that you're looking at. But I think within that context, I would say when you want to have a singular focus, a North Star is a powerful way to do it.
Yeah. So it's maybe like more per product of your business within the big organization. Because in your example of Uber, that's all they do, right? Well, they have Uber Eats as well.
Now they have Uber Eats. Right.
Yeah, maybe some other things. And I'm sure that one is conceptually different thing. It's not about rides, it's about bringing deliveries. So maybe they have number of deliveries.
Meals delivered. Maybe you'd say meals delivered on time.
Yeah, or maybe, right.
Something along those lines. But it's a different product than the original Uber product. Yeah.
So in that case, even though maybe the same drivers delivering, instead of people, now they deliver food. So it's a different metric in that case. And an example of Google, it would be many different ones for YouTube, for Gmail, and for all other products that they have. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, so then, like with anything, it's a tool, and you want, the practitioner of the tool, the one who's leveraging the tool, needs to have a sense of where and why you want to do it, use it, and for what purpose, right? And so that's where it's like, I think the compellingness of the story that you want to tell is really central to the purpose of a North Star.
Yeah. And then, do you have any examples maybe of tooling and how people actually measure in progress, whether it's dashboards or whatnot, or any sort of examples?
Yeah, the main thing that I would suggest, there are so many tools. I think what you align it with whatever your tooling is. The nice thing about a North Star is that as a singular metric, you don't have to be wedded to whatever tools you have. So a spreadsheet I think, one of the keys to using it is to talk about it frequently, right? As an element of focus, you want to be building and reinforcing that this is more important than everything else going on, right? So one of the things that I talk about is, and when I used a North Star in the company that I managed, I got onto YouTube every 2 weeks. We were a radically transparent company. So the update that I gave to my investor was public. It was on YouTube every 2 weeks. And it's the same update that my team and my customers and my investor all saw. And I started every update by saying, here's where we expected to be on our North Star metric, and here's where we are today. And most of the time I was above that line. Sometimes I dropped below it. And if I ever dropped below it, I immediately said, and here, we are below that line, and we are taking action to try to get back above the line. That was always the most, if we ever dropped below that line, that became the centerpiece of the update that I wanted to give.
Like the reasons behind it and how to correct and things like that.
Yeah. So to give you a more, just hone in specifically on the question you asked, which is the tool. In this case, I used a spreadsheet. But I think the most important thing is that you think about where you want to be at the end of your story. So we had an end date of like what we wanted to achieve by the end of the year. And then make sure you have a tracking line that shows where that is today. Where, what does end of year success look like? And based on that, where should you be right now? And that's always going to give you a sense of, are you at the line, above the line, or below the line? And that's going to be the central piece of information that's going to allow you to take action and turn it into an actionable metric, right? It's like, if you're below that line, what are we going to do to get back on it?
So I think I heard that North Star metric comes together with the goal. So you have a goal of certain number, and then this North Star metric is basically your measure at any point in time towards that goal, and that gap is basically what you're trying to close. Because before it seemed to me like it's just a number, and as long as it grows over time, we're good to go, and there's no like upper limit to it. But it could also be an upper limit with that goal in mind and saying we need, I don't know, whatever number to reach, and maybe time frame also. Could it be that way?
That's a great point. Yeah, the North Star. When you bring it together in time, you can talk about where you want to be in your story by that time. So I'll give you an example. The company that I was running, we were starting 0 to 1, and we were still looking for product market fit. We just, it was a very new product. We were trying a lot of things. We were trying a lot of different features. We started out with a fairly generic North Star metric of weekly active users. Okay, just our people coming in and using the application. And our goal, we had nobody using the application. And so we said the first thing to being relevant is have people use it, because having people use the application is also going to then be the thing that's going to create a positive cycle. And it's also going to give us the feedback of telling how are we doing. We're going to learn from our users and be able to understand the value, why they're coming. And that will help give us some signal that we can use to find product market fit. And so we set a goal of, by the end of the year, we want to get to 2,000 weekly active users. We had no idea how we were going to get there, but we just drew we basically used the Y Combinator 10% week over week growth starting point. So we said, well, we had like 5 or 10 people that logged in. So we said, okay, let's start with 5 or 10 people using the application, grow it 10% week over week, map that out for a year and a half, I think, and see where that goes. And if you do the math, it comes out to, roughly 1,800 weekly active users or something like that. So we're like, well, we don't want to shoot for 1,800. Let's shoot for 2,000. So we rounded up and said, that's our goal. And so that we used the North Star metric as a way to create a goal that we were then going for.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good picture of how somebody may use it to set up, because if you don't have anything, no users, no revenue, then you really get stuck how to figure out what to measure. So that's a good one. And yeah, that's great. Yeah. And then, so switching gears a little bit to these other types of metrics that are not really North Star metrics. There is a lot of vanity metrics, and how we should focus or not focus, or why should focus on them rather, is my question.
Yeah. Well, so let's just say what a vanity metric is. A vanity metric is something that, and I want to be cautious here, because there are a lot of KPIs that are valuable that show that may be some signs of traction that are not necessarily North Stars. So in the context here, I'm calling them vanity metrics. Typical ones that I would consider vanity metrics are, the number of downloads, the number of page views, the number of employees, right? And these are things where, the fact that somebody downloaded something doesn't actually indicate that they read it. Okay. And now if you have a product that is a content marketing product that is about sort of, you're saying to your customers, hey, we'll increase your download rate. Well, then the number of downloads could be very relevant. But for most things, a download is actually more of a top of funnel kind of metric. It's something that's helping you see, it's a gauge of initial interest. It's not a recognition that value has been created or that the customer has received some value from it. And so that's where it's like, in this context, I consider that a vanity metric and not something that would be a good North Star. And maybe even too easily actionable. You can run a marketing campaign, like, page views. You can run a marketing campaign or an ad campaign, and you can just pay people to come to your site. That's not showing that they've actually gotten any value, but you have achieved that metric, right? And so that's a place where it's like that I would consider that something that it's almost too easy to make it look good, and therefore not a recognition. It's not a good North Star.
Okay, that makes sense. Because it's a kind of like a trap. Sometimes people like to focus on these things to show traction, to show progress, to show things. But then at the end of the day, does it really make a difference? Does it really make more value to people?
Right.
Yeah.
It's also, so I think it fails the valuable test. It does not really achieve the actionable test, maybe the inverse, maybe it's too actionable, and it doesn't satisfy the investable test, right? The number of page views your investor, unless you're doing a content play, right? If you're building a social media platform, page views could be relevant. But in most other contexts, having somebody come to your website is not actually something that's going to be attractive enough to be the centerpiece of an investable story.
Yeah. And then also let's talk about some of the common mistakes that you know about that people may make while figuring out their North Star metric.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest mistake that people make is not having one. And I'd say the second biggest mistake that people make is having two.
Okay. There's two north. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's so many. I mean, there's so many conversations that I would have with founders where it's, you say, well, what's your North Star metric? And they say, well, we have this and we have this, right? And the way I think about it is, and again, this is a tool. Everybody's entitled to sort of run their company the way they want to run their company. But I don't think I don't think the tool is really doing the service of focusing if you have 2 points, because now you have 2 different things that your team could be going for, and they may or may not be well aligned. And I guarantee those are not your only 2 KPIs. Those are actually every company is going to have more than 2 KPIs. And so if you can't choose one North Star, now you actually have 2. They easily get mixed up with the whole flood of other KPIs that you have. And then you don't have focus. And if you as a founder can't say there's one thing more important than all the others, imagine how your team feels, right? Yeah. They're not in the same level of clarity as you. And so if you as a leader can't provide that level of focus, your team is going to be even more distracted.
Yeah. Simple analogies in my head now is like in software development, in Scrum methodology, for example, we have this single goal for the sprint. And how many times I see that development teams create multiple goals for themselves. Like in this sprint, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. And I always say like, okay, let's pick one main thing that absolutely has to be done. It's okay if there are more things has to be done, but which one is actually like bringing the most value to users? And it's a hard work to shift that mind, because people naturally, especially if it's a larger team, a few people working on something, they want to show that they did many things in a period of time, right? Like in the sprint, in this case, in like 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever. And I think same for the company. They just don't want to repeat the same number over and over. They want to show many numbers and everything is growing. So
yeah. Here's a good thought experiment, right? Like imagine that you asked what's the one thing that you can do, and I said imagination is the best. Imagine that 6 months from now you want to buy a billboard. What do you want to print on that billboard? What do you want to say? Hey, we got this done. And it's a great example when you're when you're designing a billboard. You're not going to say, hey, we accomplished this and this and this and this, right? It's just too much. It can't be on the billboard. Now, in order to put something on the billboard of meaning, you are going to have to do a lot of things, but don't lose sight of the main thing you want to be able to say on the billboard. And so that's just a great thought exercise that you could say. It's like, imagine 6 months from now, I want to take out a billboard on the main highway outside of my, where I live. And I want to say, we accomplished this. What is it you want to put there? That's a good indicator of what a good North Star would be.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good example. So there may be some times, or will there be any time in the life of company that they need to change North Star metric? Is it recommended to change it?
Yeah. So the best reason to change it is that you've achieved your objective.
Okay.
Right? So in fact, at the company I ran, when we hit the 2,000 weekly active users, and we did, I mean, we just pulled out all the stops. We did everything we could think of. It brought us in totally new directions. So it actually led us to a very different kind of product than what we had imagined building, right? And that's another thing that Y Combinator talks about a lot, is once you've chosen a North Star metric, keep it growing, keep working on it, because sometimes it actually brings you to things that are more interesting than what you imagined as the starting, what you thought was on your product roadmap. But after we achieved it, we took a step back and we said, is it valuable to keep growing this? And we realized that actually, in some ways, that had become a vanity metric. We had learned how to manipulate that number. Manipulate's a strong word. We learned how to affect it. We learned how to get more people coming into the application. But we were in the context of building communities. And so we actually wanted people to move into the communities that our customers were creating. We wanted to actually join our customer on that journey. And that meant a much more engaged type of user than just an active user. It actually was somebody who was going to choose to relocate their home from where they're living today to a new place. And so we actually changed our metric to residents, like the number of people living in the community that we were in. Now you can see that that's valuable, actionable, and investable, right? It's a little harder on the actionable side. That was where it was kind of the weakest, but it's incredibly valuable. If we're helping our communities grow, it's very relevant. And the more people that are living in communities that are powered by the software we were creating, the more investable we are. Now, actionable, we did a lot of things there. It actually brought up a whole bunch of new strategies for the company and kind of reoriented us. And that's where I'd get to the second sort of reason is a pivot. So I'd say best reason to change is you've achieved your objective. Second best reason is that you're pivoting. You're realizing that you've learned something and you want to adjust course. And again, this is a place where it's like, hey, your North Star is a guide light. So you might be going kind of in this direction. You might see that you're kind of pointed over there and realize, you know what? We need to veer 30% that direction. Let's change our North Star. So we're now going in a slightly different direction. Hopefully it's not a 180. Sometimes you learn and you have to take a 180, but mostly you're going to be better off if you sort of are sort of weaving along your way. If you don't have perfect clarity, you're better off moving fast and adjusting your North Star as you go.
Mm-hmm. Is there any downside to, I imagine there is, but is there any significant downside to doing it too frequently? Have you seen customers changing it too much, or how long does it take usually for people to realize it and run this test and figure out if it's right course or we need to switch it?
Yeah. I don't know that there's if you're changing it frequently, it's a sign that your company you don't have good traction. Right. And I also think as a focal point, you want to make sure that you are giving it a really solid effort and really working on it. So, but also you shouldn't stick with it if you've learned that it's not the right thing. If you need to pivot, you need to pivot, right? So I guess a lot of that has to do with to what extent has what you've learned changed your company or your product direction in a substantial way? And do you have visibility to a better North Star? Like, don't go directionless, don't take the rudders off and just have no metrics or have too many metrics. Always have a North Star. But if you see a better one than the one you're chasing, use that as an opportunity to change and use it as an opportunity to communicate with your company about why you're changing and what you've learned, because those are powerful moments of alignment and good cultural touchstones and opportunities to orient your team toward the thing that you've now discovered is more important than the one you were going toward.
Are there any good strategies to keep people motivated to just focus on one metric versus many different ones? Maybe it's leaders, or maybe it's also teams.
Tell me a little bit more about your thinking there. What's your What
Like
are you
I'm
imagining in this
thinking,
scenario?
yeah. So some people maybe just, for example, not very disciplined, or maybe they're just trying to pick some metric and they think it's a good one, but then they will quickly realize, oh no, we actually need to do this, and then a couple months later, no, we actually need to do that. Or teams, maybe they don't buy into that and they still doing business as usual, not focusing on it. Those type situations, are there any strategies or things how to like motivate people to keep marching
Yeah.
toward that metric?
Well, I believe that leadership is very important. And this is, I said, one of my goals and what I like to help leaders work on is to lead with confidence and authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I think in order to achieve big results, you need focus. So I think that, a North Star can help and provide that kind of focus. I would say in order to keep people motivated, I think one of the biggest things that a leader can do is talk about it and ask about it. So for me, when I was leading the company, like I said, I got on YouTube every 2 weeks and I had to say what the goal was and where we are, where we should be today, and where we actually are. Right.
Mm-hmm.
By talking about that, by knowing that I was going to have to get up and give a presentation that included this as the main thing, well, I then when I was preparing for my sprint updates, I would ask my leaders, I'd ask my leadership team, how are we doing on this number? And they would always have to therefore ask their team, how are we doing on this number? What can we do to get it? And they didn't want to surprise me. They would ask and they would find out and they would say, what are we going to do differently to change it? And so just by me saying, I'm going to say where we are every single sprint, by giving that update every 2 weeks, I'm making a public commitment that I'm going to keep my attention on this. And I don't want to be embarrassed, and I want to know what's going on. And so I, therefore, am going to ask the questions. If we're missing, it's not like it's the end of the world if we miss. There were many times what we missed, but missing and not being able to talk about what we're going to change, what we've learned in the process of missing, that's bad. Missing and saying, hey, we realize that we missed and we're learning and we're changing how we're doing it. And we are going to catch up on this date. That's actually a very powerful learning moment for me as a leader and for the entire team.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. No, that's great. That's good. And then also, um, when somebody's listening right now and thinking, where do I start? How should I go with the default revenue, or should I try to do this visualization and come up with something, or just pick something random and try to test? What would be your recommendation for somebody who thinking about this and want to start with it
Yeah,
as a first thing?
it's a great question. I think there's so many contexts in which this can apply. So there's not a stock answer.
Yeah.
I think the advice that I would have is think about the story you want to tell and when you want to tell that story. Maybe to whom, right? And so if you're a startup, you might be thinking about what is the story that I want to tell in my next pitch, my next fundraising round. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If you're operating in a company, it may be based on the release of the product or another major milestone, or maybe when you want to be up for promotion, right? To be a little bit more self-centered there. But whatever it is, there's always these times where you know that you're going to have an opportunity to tell a story. And think about what is the main thing, what is the most important thing that you want to tell in that story. If you're going to have one graph that's the centerpiece of the story, think about what that graph is going to look like and how that and what you've achieved. What's your billboard, right? And then that's right there is going to be whatever you're plotting on that graph is a pretty good candidate for a North Star metric, because that's going to be the centerpiece of the compelling story that you want to tell.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It will depend on the circumstances for the company or person, things like that. Yeah. And then Is there anything else that you would like to mention about North Star metric? Maybe something we didn't talk about, I didn't ask you about, but there's still something like an advice or something you want to leave listeners with?
I would say it's hard. It's hard to keep focus, and it's because it's hard to keep focus. That's often why it's so important to do so. Great things come from teams that are focused and empowered to do it. And the North Star can be both a good way of focusing and a good way of empowering, because your whole team knows that if they can come up with something that's going to move the needle on the North Star, it's going to be well received. And so it is a way of sort of helping everybody kind of move, keep everybody in alignment and help them anticipate. That's the other thing is, like, if you have an exponential growth on a North Star metric, and you have that line plotted out, that today we may only have 10, but in 2 months we need to be thinking about 100. And so that helps everybody anticipate and solve the problem that they know they're going to be dealing with very, very shortly. And it's just a very good shorthand for doing it. But that doesn't take away the fact that it's hard, because it's, even for me to get on YouTube every 2 weeks and, commit to saying what my North Star was and where we were, it was a frightening experience every single time. It's like, are we going to keep growing? Are we going to find a way to do it? And that's one of the things that's just, leading growth is fundamentally a hard thing. And your North Star metric, and therefore doing a North Star metric, is going to be hard. You're going to feel that public accountability to it. But that challenge is part of what makes it so valuable and makes it a really powerful tool to leading with confidence and authenticity.
Yeah, that's great. And then also, if you can mention how people can connect with you or learn more from you about North Star metrics and things like that.
Yeah, I would love to engage with your community. Thank you so much. I think LinkedIn is the best. My handle is Nolan Myers. I'm sure you'll have my name on the podcast, so it's pretty easy to map from that to my LinkedIn profile and find me. And just send me a message on LinkedIn. I think that's the easiest way to connect, and it'd be a joy to hear from you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll add your contact information to the description so people can easily pin you from there. Yeah. All right. Well, Nolan, thank you very much. It was a very educational conversation. And I hope people are motivated now to go and think about it and try to have some focus and figure out their North Star metric. So, yeah, let's hope for that.
Thank you, Vit. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, same here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.